Good afternoon, everyone. Jess, I hope that's okay, that you can see that slide okay. Fantastic. So thanks very much for allowing me to share what was really a very interesting observation that we were able to make during the summer of 2019 and 2020. And this is dealing with the impacts of fire on a type of Australian native animal that I think a lot of people would be happy for fires to wipe out, and that's the mosquitoes. The work that I'm sharing with you today was conducted in the lands of the Dharawal and Darug nations. People, I pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I'm talking to you today from Westmead Hospital, which is on the lands of the people of the Darug nation. And so a little bit of background first, I think, is really important. So Australia has an incredibly diverse and often abundant mosquito fauna. There's more than 300 species, but there's only really a handful, maybe a dozen or so, that pose any significant pest or public health concern. Unfortunately, those mosquitoes can transmit pathogens that make us sick. And so the transmission of viruses like Ross River virus and Barmah Forest virus infect about 5,000 people every year across the country. In New South Wales, the mosquitoes that are of greatest concern are typically associated with coastal wetlands. These are wetlands that are influenced by tides. The brackish water and estuarine conditions provide ideal habitat for the salt marsh mosquito Aedes Vigilax, which is really one of the most important pests. Anybody spending any time on the east coast of Australia has probably been bitten by this mosquito during the summer months. The abundance of this mosquito drives those public health threats, but there's still a lot that we need to learn about how the interaction of extreme environmental and climatic effects influence not only the abundance of mosquitoes, but also the wildlife that are reservoirs for some of the pathogens the mosquitoes spread that make us sick. And so understanding these conditions might help us prepare for the future and be strategic in our planning for how we can minimize public health risks associated with mosquitoes during these extreme weather events. So this work was conducted in the wetlands along the Georges River. So for those of you not familiar with that, it's in the southern edge of the Sydney metropolitan region and runs pretty much from Cronulla out to Bankstown in southwestern Sydney. There's extensive estuarine and brackish water wetlands in these areas, and the wetlands are located quite close to both residential and recreational areas. Historically, we have seen some exceptional increases in mosquito populations in these areas over the summer months, and we have seen local clusters of mosquito-borne disease, particularly Ross River virus. So it's one of the few places in high density Sydney metropolitan areas where we do see outbreaks of Ross River virus. So as a consequence, a lot of the local health authorities are mindful about how they can better manage mosquito risks, but also understand their interactions with the environment and predict these potential increases in public health risks. Liverpool City Council manage some of the areas in the western ends of the Georges River, and they'd commenced a trial of mosquito management in some coastal wetlands that included salt marsh, sedgeland, and coastal swamp oak sort of forest during the season 2019 to 2020. And that program included not only a selection of some mosquito control products to use, but also a surveillance program that was put into place to see, not only to track the effectiveness of the control program, but to provide guidance as to when mosquito control should be undertaken. Now, what was really interesting about this season, you might remember back into November, December 2019, it was incredibly dry. Most of the state was in drought. We didn't see any rain. We didn't see much tidal inundation of these habitats. And to be honest, during that end of spring and start to summer, there were hardly any mosquitoes about in these environments. There was no water to prompt their hatch and development. But in early January 2020, there was a bushfire that ran through these areas, sort of burning both sedgeland, coastal sheoaks forest, and also some of the wetlands themselves. That was followed about 10 days later by some high tides that came in and inundated this area shortly after it had been impacted by bushfire. And so this provided a really unique opportunity to study how these mosquitoes in the environments responded to bushfire. This is not the type of experiment that you necessarily would set out to do, but it's a good example of being having the good fortune of being in the right place at the right time to make these observations about how insects are responding to bushfire. So as I mentioned, we'd already started setting up some surveillance in these areas because they'd been identified as being a source of mosquitoes that were impacting residents in the local suburbs such as Hammondville and Voyager Point. You can see these examples in the photos on the left, the difference that had resulted from this bushfire. Unfortunately, I understand a bushfire that was deliberately lit. It didn't burn for very long, but it burnt quite intensively in some areas. But also some of these habitats were only marginally burnt. And I'll explain why that's important in a moment. So as I mentioned, we had a number of sampling locations throughout this sort of matrix of wetland habitat. And we collect mosquitoes in a couple of different ways. We collect adult mosquitoes by using carbon dioxide baited light traps. You can see a photo of one of these traps in the middle of that slide there. And these traps essentially trick mosquitoes into thinking this is a person or a kangaroo. The mosquitoes are attracted to the carbon dioxide and there's a small light and fan that blows them down into a catch bucket. This is pretty much the gold standard for collecting mosquitoes in Australia, and health authorities across the country use this to measure changes in mosquito populations. We also collect the immature stages of mosquitoes from ground pools and other habitats with a high-tech piece of equipment that pretty much looks like a soup ladle. It's the collection of immature mosquitoes in these aquatic habitats, which we can then identify and compare the density of mosquito larvae between tidal events or other environmental factors. You can see a couple of photos here of the types of habitats we're working in, particularly within that coastal swamp oak forest. These are areas where there's depressions throughout the habitats that trap water after rainfall, but this area is also inundated by tides. And so when those tide waters recede, particularly after the spring tides, that water is retained in these pools and ponds. And eggs that have been laid by the mosquitoes in this vegetation hatch takes about a week or so for mosquitoes to complete their development during the summer months. So how did these larval mosquito populations change after bushfires? So as I mentioned earlier, this area was already under surveillance for mosquitoes to inform the local mosquito control program, but that was disrupted when bushfire sort of swept through this area. Some of the habitats were burnt quite intensively, but others were only really partly burnt. And some of the aquatic vegetation, the reeds and rushes, survived the bushfire. But you can see in this slide a picture of just one of the pools that was in an area that had been impacted by fire. And the water that was brought into these habitats was by tidal inundation about 10 days after the bushfire. So it's relatively recently after that fire. Now, the chart that I'm showing you here on the right is the average density of mosquito larvae that we were collecting in habitats that were either completely burnt or partially burnt during the bushfire. Now, you can see that the red columns there, mosquito populations actually increased after the fire. Now, I don't want that to be confusing to think that fire encourages mosquito populations. It's just that we hadn't seen the extent of inundation of water into these habitats prior to the bushfire. We hadn't had the extensive tidal inundation that we would have otherwise expected. So the two takeaways from this data was that, firstly, mosquito eggs had clearly survived being burnt in these habitats. There wasn't time, nor the adult mosquito populations at the time, to lay more eggs. So they've survived that fire and hatched when the tidal inundation has occurred. But also there was much greater extent of tidal inundation. That's why probably the mosquito populations were higher in these burned and partly burned habitats. And I'm talking here specifically about the larvae of Aedes Vigilax, the salt marsh mosquito. I did collect the larvae of two other mosquitoes, Verulina funaria and Aedes alternans, but really just a couple of specimens each, and not enough to really compare any abundances between them. So I guess the first question we had when we started to see mosquito larvae was what happened to the mortality or the survivorship of these larvae? Did they come through to adulthood? And this slide shows a little bit about the data we collected from the adult mosquito traps. You can see that I've presented here a range of mosquito species collected in the traps located in this area 2 weeks prior to the bushfire and 5 weeks following it. And initially after the bushfire, mosquito populations really declined quite dramatically. And I think that's probably not only the response because of the fire itself, but also the dry conditions at that time. But if we consider that it was around about the start of the second week of January that we saw the water come into that area, concomitant with the life cycle of these mosquitoes, we saw a dramatic increase in the populations of adult mosquitoes collected in these traps. Now, the species I've presented here are found in a wide range of habitats, including freshwater habitats and water holding containers in nearby residential areas. So I want to talk just a little bit specifically about Aedes vigilax. And this is the major pest species, and this is just a graphical representation of the total number of Aedes vigilax we collected in these traps in the weeks after the bushfire and after tidal inundation of those wetlands. So you can see from the 19th of January onwards, we started to see a dramatic bounce back or an increase in the adult populations of Aedes vigilax, which strongly suggests that those mosquito larvae completed their development in those burnt and partly burnt habitats. So the mosquito eggs not only survived the bushfire, but even the conditions within these pools and ponds that have been filled with tides was enough to allow the mosquitoes to complete their development. So in summary, with this sort of brief observation that we made, there's evidence to suggest that these eggs of Aedes vigilax survived a moderate fire burning by a bushfire. Adult populations crash, but as you would expect, they're heavily impacted when the fires come through. Now, this is the first time this has been observed for mosquitoes in Australia, and generally the phenomenon hasn't really been studied internationally. There's some studies in North America and Africa where they used fire as a management tool in wetlands, but funnily enough, they showed that it was of limited effectiveness as well. So I think the take-home message here is that particularly where there's a bit of moisture in the soil, vegetation survives, maybe the temperatures don't get intense enough to kill those eggs. Keep in mind, these mosquito eggs are designed or have evolved to adapt to hypersaline and dry conditions on salt marshes that get incredibly hot, dry and salty during the summer months. So the results suggest here that mosquitoes in coastal wetlands are resilient to bushfire. And so when we're, from a public health point of view in these areas, we need to be mindful that just because areas have burnt doesn't mean mosquito populations won't be a problem. And that has an impact for both local community and those responding after the recovery of bushfire as well. We need to know a little bit more about how bushfires affect the animals that are reservoir hosts for viruses like Ross River virus. They're mostly native marsupials like kangaroos and wallabies. So it's difficult to understand how the risks of mosquito-borne disease might change immediately after bushfire. There's a lot of work to be done in that field. It is worth mentioning, though, that in 2020, we actually had our biggest year for Ross River virus cases in New South Wales on record. And that was mostly driven by incredible rainfall we had in early February. And in this location in particular, we did detect Ross River virus and Barmah Forest virus in local mosquitoes. So health authorities really need to be mindful about when there's these competing impacts on public health, particularly in response to extreme weather events. We need to be mindful about how the community may be exposed to mosquitoes and mosquito-borne disease. So I'd like to finish up by acknowledging Stephen Hadozi and Raphael Canizetti from Liverpool City Council, who helped out with some of this work, as well as John Clancy and John Hadiotis at New South Wales Health Pathology and Alabil Chowdhury from the University of Sydney. So thanks. I'm happy to answer any questions if there's time.
That's an excellent talk. Thanks, Cameron. Really interesting to hear about the fire impacts from a slightly different angle. Did anyone have any questions? If so, pop them into chat. So there's one. Thanks, Cameron. This is from Peter Langlands. Thanks, Cameron. Would there be more bites on humans if the local mammals are removed?
Yeah, we think so, because most of these mosquitoes that we have problems with, these coastal salt marsh mosquitoes, they're pretty indiscriminate into the types of animals that they want or sources of blood meals they want to get to. So with a decline with native mammals you'd expect, and birds, you'd expect there probably would be a greater focus on the humans that were active in the local area. So that's a good question, and I suspect the answer is, yeah, unfortunately more bites.
I just had a quick question. I don't know much about mosquito ecology or biology, but would there be any chance that eggs could be washed in by these tidal events from unburnt areas into and collecting these pools?
Yeah, that's a great question. That was one of the things that we considered. Previous studies in salt marsh environments show that eggs aren't readily distributed by tides, and actually larvae aren't readily distributed by tides either. So we suspect that's not the case. But the other thing too to consider in this site, which I didn't talk about in great detail, but it's a relatively closed off, discrete area of habitat. And so there wasn't really any unburnt areas or significantly unburnt areas that either eggs or larvae could have been washed into.
That's excellent. Thanks so much, Cameron.